There's a moment that happens in the middle of an ordinary day, and most women remember it far longer than they remember the expensive dinner or the planned surprise. It's small, it's almost invisible if you're not paying attention. And it happens so rarely that when it does, something in her relaxes in a way she didn't expect. Most people assume the things that draw a woman closer to a man are grand: the right words, the right plans, the right amount of confidence in the right moment. That belief isn't wrong exactly, but it skips over something quieter and far more powerful. What most people don't realize is that there's a single gesture, barely talked about, that tends to mean more to a woman than almost anything a man can say. Stay with me here because this isn't what you think it is. Think about the kind of attention most relationships run on. Words exchanged, plans made, compliments given. All of it happens out loud in language where it can be heard, analyzed, remembered, repeated back later. Language is useful, but here is what matters. Language can also be performed. Anyone can say the right thing without meaning it. Anyone can learn the script. A gesture is different. A gesture either happens or it doesn't. It can't be faked nearly as convincingly because it requires action in the moment, not just words prepared in advance. Imagine this. A woman is carrying something heavy across a parking lot, struggling slightly, adjusting her grip every few steps. A man notices from a distance and, without announcing it, without making it a whole production, simply walks over and takes it from her hands. He doesn't ask if she wants help in a way that gives her the burden of deciding. He doesn't wait for her to struggle long enough to clearly need rescuing. He just moves, takes the weight, and keeps walking beside her like it was never a question. This is where things become interesting. On the surface, this looks like simple courtesy, the kind covered in etiquette guides from decades ago. But watch her face in that moment. Something shifts that has very little to do with the weight of the object itself. We'll come back to exactly what that shift is, but first, consider what's actually happening underneath such a small, ordinary action. Picture yourself carrying something difficult, literally or otherwise, for a long stretch of time. Not because you wanted to prove something, but because nobody around you seemed to notice you were carrying it at all. Over months, sometimes years, this becomes a quiet expectation. That effort goes unseen. That struggle has to be obvious and prolonged before anyone steps in. That you are, by default, the one who manages things alone. The deeper truth is this: most women carry far more than they let on, not because they enjoy carrying it, but because very few people around them ever offer to take any of it without being explicitly asked. And asking repeatedly for help with things that should be obvious eventually starts to feel exhausting in its own right. So most women simply stop asking. They adjust their grip, they keep walking. Now we move deeper, because this is where the actual gesture reveals its real meaning. When a man takes the weight before being asked, he is doing something far more significant than helping with an object. He is demonstrating without saying a single word that he is paying attention. Not performative attention, the kind reserved for moments when he knows he's being watched or evaluated, but quiet, background attention, the kind that notices a struggle before it becomes obvious enough to require acknowledgement. This is where the gesture starts to mean more than any sentence could. Consider what's being communicated in that brief, wordless exchange. He noticed. He acted without needing permission or invitation. He didn't make her ask, didn't make her perform difficulty loudly enough to justify intervention. He simply saw and responded. And what happens next is important because this kind of unsolicited noticing touches something many women rarely admit out loud, even to themselves. A long-held, quiet fatigue from being the one who manages everything, who notices everything, who carries things, both literal and emotional, without anyone else stepping in first. But before we go there, there's something deeper still worth examining. Why does this particular kind of gesture land so differently than verbal reassurance? Why does taking the bag mean more in some strange way than saying, "I'm here for you" a dozen times? Because words describing support are an offer. They require the other person to test them, to actually lean on the offer and see whether it holds. A gesture like this isn't an offer. It's already proof. The weight is already gone from her hands by the time she's processed what happened. There's no test required because the support already occurred before she had to ask for it or verify it. This is where the entire idea of masculine presence starts to look different than most people assume. Many men, especially younger ones still learning what makes them desirable, believe that strength is best expressed through confidence, through dominance in conversation, through being unshakable under pressure. These things matter, but there's a quieter form of strength almost nobody talks about. The strength required to notice someone else's burden before they've had to announce it, and the humility required to relieve it without turning the moment into a performance of how helpful or considerate you are. There is something deeper happening here, and it has to do with how safety, real safety, the kind that builds trust slowly over time, is actually established between two people. Most people believe trust is built through big promises, through declarations of loyalty and commitment spoken in serious moments. But trust, the kind that settles into someone's nervous system rather than just their mind, tends to be built through repeated, small, unspoken proofs that someone is paying attention even when nothing dramatic is happening. The bag carried without being asked, the door reached before she gets there, the space made for her to walk on the safer side of the sidewalk without comment, without acknowledgement expected in return. These moments, individually, seem almost too small to matter. But cumulatively, they teach a woman something her conscious mind may never fully articulate. That she is not invisible in this person's awareness. That she doesn't have to ask, explain, or justify needing a moment of ease. That somebody else is quietly watching for ways to lighten what she carries, without needing credit for doing so. Now we move deeper still, because this is where the entire idea reaches its core. The deepest truth is this. The gesture that matters most isn't really about the bag, the door, or the literal weight involved at all. It's about what the gesture proves regarding the kind of attention a man is capable of offering when nothing requires it of him. Words can be summoned on demand, in the right context, with the right emotional cue. Unsolicited noticing cannot. It either exists as a baseline way of moving through the world, or it doesn't. And there is no convincing performance of it that holds up under repetition. This is why so few men actually do this consistently, not because the gesture itself is difficult, but because it requires a kind of outward attention many men have never been taught to practice. Attention that isn't focused on how he's coming across, but on what someone else might be quietly struggling with in this exact moment, regardless of whether struggling with it loudly enough to be obvious. And this reframes the entire original question. The question most people start with is, what can I do to make her feel cared for? But that question assumes care has to be communicated through deliberate action, through moments planned in advance to demonstrate thoughtfulness. The deeper, more honest question is this: have I trained myself to notice what other people are carrying, even when they've stopped expecting anyone to notice? Because the gesture only means something once that noticing has become automatic, rather than performed. So the better question isn't about what to do in a single moment to impress someone. It's about whether you've become the kind of person who sees effort before it's announced, who steps in before being asked, who treats someone else's quiet burden as something worth acting on simply because you noticed it existed. Once that becomes who you are, rather than something you do, you won't need grand declarations or perfectly timed gestures. You'll simply move through the world, noticing and acting, and the people around you will feel the difference long before they can explain why. If this opens something for you, there is much more beneath the surface of how quiet, unspoken attention builds the kind of trust that grand gestures rarely manage to create on their own. Stay close. This understanding is only the beginning.